Death Walks on Mars by Alan J. Ramm. Read for you by Elaine Frank. There was death above. The Martian sand vulture swooped and hissed and twitched its barbed, poisonous tail in the thin air. There was death below. The man lay cradled in the pebbly sand, red sand that matched the color of his hair and the color of the blood oozing slowly from the hole in his forehead and trickling greasily along the inside of his punctured head bubble. The air whistled thinly through the corresponding hole in the bubble as the oxygen converter tried vainly to maintain the proper breathing mixture. There was death in the muzzle of the gun dangling nonchalantly from the tall man's gloved hand. It grinned from his face, etched in the sardonic twist that the purple scar gave to his right cheek. It danced in the emotionless distances of his eyes. There was death in every beat of Lita Carson's heart. With the adaptability of a pioneer, she accepted the fact of death, even that of her husband's. The last 2 long Martian years had tested Terry's and her love, refined it with hardships and discouragement. The menacing gun was an easy way to rejoin him, but it was too easy, too soft a response to unwarranted killing. With unrelenting determination, she kindled and fanned to life a fierce resolve that the 3 men before her would pay, as slowly and as painfully as possible, for what they had done. Through lips necessarily stiff with the effort of controlled emotion, she asked, "Why did you kill him?"
"Didn't have anything against him, ma'am. Had to do it. Showed we meant business. Easier to handle one than 2 of you anyway."
The eyes of the tubby man who answered her kept flickering anxiously upward toward the sand vulture.
"That thing is dangerous, as they say?"
Lita turned to the 3rd and youngest man. His glance was fixed hypnotically on the death on the ground. His skin was pale and his forehead beaded with sweat. She repeated, "What did you do it for?"
"Got into trouble at Canalport. Heard a rumor that you and your husband had struck a pocket of Martian sunbursts. Fixed up a deal with the ship's cargo master to smuggle us back to Earth if we turned your stuff over to him. He jetted us out here, left a while ago."
The fat man itched frantically as he answered her. They all itched, Lita noticed. It took a long time on Mars before anyone became used to the dust that penetrated even the protecto suits. It produced an agony that demanded attention, followed by festering sores.
"You talk too much, Fatso,"
the tall one said, angrily.
"What's the difference, Rick?"
Fatso said, philosophically.
"Won't do her any good."
Rick turned to Lita.
"At least you know the score. Do you want to tell us where the stuff is, or are you going to make it tough on yourself?"
Eyes like a razorback sand lizard, Lita thought. "Out by our diggings," she answered readily. His eyes moved to the plastic bubble house that she and Terry had called home when they weren't digging. "Search the place, if you don't believe me," she suggested. "We never brought any of them back here with us. We cached them in the cave until we were ready to go home."
"Then you did strike it?"
the young man interrupted eagerly. She nodded. Rick turned to the young man.
"Search the house, Jocko. She may be lying."
The sand vulture wheeled and made a few low exploratory swoops toward them as they waited for Jocko. Lita automatically checked her clothing to be sure she was completely covered. If that barbed tail touched the skin, death came. Slow, agonizing, sure. Jocko came back.
"Emptier than interstellar space."
Holstering his gun, Rick started off, saying,
"Let's go, and no funny stuff."
Lita smiled ironically and remained where she was. "It's not that easy." The cave is 4 walking days away." Startled, Fatso groaned.
"Where's your sandmobile?"
"Broken down at the diggings. We came back to get parts." Fatso and Jocko cussed loudly. Rick quieted them.
"Get the parts,"
he told Lita. "You bring any water?" she asked.
"You haven't any?"
Fatso's voice rose shrilly. Lita reached to her waist and the small attached flask. "Just this. And Terry had one just like it. Enough for a couple old-timers like us. Not near enough for everyone now, particularly with you being new to Mars." Jocko snatched the flask from Terry's waist.
"I'll take that, Jocko,"
Rick commanded.
"And yours too."
He gestured to Lita. She handed it over obediently.
"But Rick,"
Fatso began.
"No arguments. Share and share alike. I'll dole it out. Now get the parts," he told Lita. "You go with her, Fatso."
As soon as they were back, the men began to move off. For the first time, Lita lost control of herself. "For God's sake, aren't you going to at least bury him?" Rick's face twisted with its wry grin as he walked back to her.
"Give the sand vulture a break. He's gotta eat."
"But," she began to protest. Swiftly, he was beside her, doing something to her fingers. The pain surged up her arm, brought her stomach up into her throat gaggingly. Then he released her, gave her a shove.
"When I say move, that's what I mean. Get going."
The cold, dry Martian air sucked the moisture irresistibly through the skin and suits. As the day slid slowly by, the ever-near horizon stayed practically featureless. The red sand bored like Callisto hornets into the skin. Lips began to crack. Twice they stopped to sip the water. The second time, Rick looked at her.
"How the devil do you know where we are?"
"Maybe I don't," she taunted.
"You'd better. We've no way of checking on you. But if you double-cross me, I'll strip your clothes off and leave you to the first sand vulture that comes along. Understand?"
"Don't worry," she answered. "I know the way. I've covered it often enough. There are many little landmarks, if you know what to look for." When evening came, Rick let each of them barely wet their lips. Then he said,
"I need sleep, and I can't trust anyone. So I'm going to hide the water in the desert. If anything happens to me, you'll all die of thirst. Now turn your backs."
Lita heard him scramble off. He soon returned.
"Now let's sleep."
The below-zero cold of the Martian night challenged the thermo unit of Lita's desert suit until she lay shivering. But, worn out from the walk and the emotional events of the day, she finally dropped off to sleep. It was still dark when she awoke. Deliberately making a noise, she listened for someone to challenge her. When no one moved, she slipped off into the desert. It took her several hours at a rapid pace to get back to the bubble house. Terry's protecto suit lay scattered over a wide area. His bones gleamed faintly in the barely discernible Martian moonlight, picked clean by the sand vulture and the razorback lizards. Flinging herself on the sand, she poured out her grief with dry, racking sobs. The power to cry had long since been sucked out of her by dehydration. Rising at last, she gathered together the things she had come for. When at last she returned to the night's camp, the 3 men were still fast asleep. Next morning, while they sat munching the tasteless emergency food tablets that were carried in the desert, Rick went after the water. Suddenly his cussing rolled across the desert toward them. Lita smiled quietly. He came back at a half-run. Disgustedly, he flung the flasks at their feet. The sides had gaps ripped in them.
"What nitwits!" he cursed. "Naturally, the cold froze the water. When it expanded, it tore the flasks apart. You knew this would happen, he accused Lita.
Of course, she admitted. Fatso struck her across the shoulders, knocking her into the sand.
None of that, Fatso, Rick commanded. We need her worse now than ever. Is there any water near? He asked Lita.
About 2 days away, and then it's a gamble whether it will be good to drink. Sometimes the water following the strata from the pole hits a pocket of mineral that's poison. When that happens, the Explorers Guild puts up a death's head sign to warn anyone from drinking it. As you know, they check every water source regularly.
Is it far from your strike?
Jocko asked. About a day's walk.
Any water at your cave?
Rick questioned. None. We didn't use much, and when we did need a supply, we got it from the outcropping I've mentioned and took it back and distilled it.
Well, we've got to head for the spring, Rick decided. And it better be good water, he warned Lita. If it isn't, and we've got to die out here, I'll see that you never bring in those sunbursts either.
They plodded voicelessly after Lita. She set as fast a pace as she dared. Even then, Fatso began to drift back.
Keep up, damn you, Rick warned. If you don't, we'll leave you here alone.
Midway through the morning, Jocko burst out.
Look at her, fresh as a Venusian pool lily. She must have some water on her.
Grimly, they searched Lita. She stiffened against their invading fingers and smiled at them derisively. I told you that a veteran doesn't need water like you do. Rick took her arm and twisted it until she crumpled with a cry onto the sand. His voice was full of suspicion.
What a fool I've been. Why didn't you abandon us last night when you had the chance?
Shrugging out of his grasp, she rose and turned to him. I wouldn't miss the pleasure of seeing you all die for all the sunbursts on Mars. She strode away at a faster pace than before. It was about 6 hours after they had been on the way that Fatso stopped and began to yell.
Damn dust! Grinding right into my guts. Got a scratch.
He ripped and tore at his clothes until his stomach was bare. With a look of unutterable satisfaction, he began to itch and dig. The swoosh could hardly be picked up. There was a long shadow, then a scream from Fatso. The sand vulture's tail came out of his belly red. Then the vulture was away, circling high and out of range. Blindly, Rick pulled his gun and fired. Fast as his trigger finger was, the poison was faster. By the third shot, Fatso began to scream. His voice rose up the scale of torture, bursting occasionally in a paean of agony. And as he screamed, he lay on the ground writhing. Before their eyes, his stomach began to bulge and turn purple from the poison. His eyes rolled up into his head, and the modes began to dribble from his lips like the litany of an insane chorus.
I can't stand it,
Jocko shouted.
How long will it last?
Not long enough, Lita answered, her voice brittle with satisfaction. Only about 10 hours, and in that time he will become mindless, an animal begging for death. Then finally he'll just grovel there, moaning and moaning and moaning.
You wanted this to happen to him,
Jocko accused. Lita looked at him. And I hope the same for you. Only worse.
Stop it, you two,
Rick commanded.
It's bad enough this way. The living must live. He is dead, and he doesn't know it. Why let him suffer?
More meat for the sand vulture, Lita suggested sarcastically. The scar on Rick's cheek flared red-purple. He leveled his gun slowly with steady aim. After the trigger was pulled, Fatso stopped moving.
More meat for the sand vulture," he answered Lita. "Now, let's move."
The red dust whispered at Lita all day. Death, death, death. Even with a pebble in her mouth to suck on, she felt her lips split and wrinkle. Her blood, sweet in her mouth, was welcome moisture. She set her shoulders forward and plodded through the endless sand and pebbly underfooting. Toward evening, Jocko stumbled and fell several times. At last he lay limply, looking to Lita and Rick pleadingly. His lips moved slackly until he at last managed to croak, "Gotta rest. Can't go on. Please don't leave me." Rick mouthed his reply thickly.
"I'm pretty beat myself. Let's rest."
Lita flopped to the sand without an answer. Her mouth was full of tongue, the pebble she had been sucking feeling like a file against her lips. Every muscle ached, every cell screamed for moisture. After a long, wordless rest, Rick hauled himself to his feet and faced Lita.
"Can't trust you now. You'll sneak off and leave us alone."
Lita looked at him scornfully. "Don't worry about that. I meant what I said. I want to see you die."
"Still got to watch you,"
Rick replied. He turned to Jocko.
"You get some rest first. I'll watch her. Later, I'll wake you to take over."
Lita molded a hip hole in the sand and settled down. The night cold had long descended when the two men changed shifts. All through his trick, Rick had sat facing her. She lay quietly, simulating sleep. At last Jocko began to nod and doze. For a while he managed to jerk himself awake, but he finally fell over and slept. Cautiously she crept over to him and shook his arm. He didn't stir. Satisfaction touched with grim humor warmed her internally as she bent over him and removed his boots. She moved with them off into the desert. Satisfied at last that she was far enough from camp, she heaved the boots into the desert darkness. She wasn't gone long, but even so, she had barely settled down again when she heard Rick shake Jocko.
"Wake up, you fool! I'd like to kill you for this. The girl could have crept off, and you wouldn't have known it." "I'm sorry, Rick, but I'm tired. I couldn't help it."
Rick began to cuss, but stopped.
"What's the use? Go back to sleep. I'll finish your watch."
It wasn't until they were ready to move the next morning that Jocko noticed that his boots were missing. He turned to Lita.
"You stole them." "Don't be a damned fool,"
Rick answered.
"She was watched all night. You probably had a nightmare and heaved them out into the desert. Let's look."
Lita watched them search in an ever-widening circle. Limping and still bootless, Jocko moved with Rick back to the camp.
"You'll have to try it as is,"
Rick was saying as they came close.
"But I can't,"
Jocko whined.
"The dust almost drove me crazy with them on. What will I do this way?" "That's your problem,"
Rick said callously.
"Come or stay here alone. It's up to you."
He turned to Lita.
"Glad to see you look so lousy this morning. At least you are suffering some too. If you're telling the truth, we'll be at the pool tomorrow."
They were on the way about a half hour when the sand around Jocko's feet began to boil. Almost immediately his voice rose shrilly and then disappeared except for twitchings on his cheeks and lips.
"What's wrong, Jocko?"
Rick asked. "His feet," Lita said laconically. It looked as though Jocko was sinking into the sand. Then the red stain spreading into the sand told a different story. "Razorback lizards," Lita informed Rick. "They're all over the place. Come to life during the day when it's a little warmer. Our footwear keeps them off. But Jocko's feet haven't any protection, so they can get at him.
They'll slice away at him a fraction of an inch at a time. In 15 minutes, there won't be anything left but his suit and a skeleton. Pleasant death, eh, Rick? But after all, they do have to eat, as you have said." Jocko toppled and lay twitching on his side, the legs of his protecto suit apparently buried in the sand. The pant legs were strangely deflated, except for the twisting and squirming of the unseen lizards as they ate their way into the upper part of the suit. It took less than 15 minutes. At the end, Lita looked away. Once, long ago, she had watched in horror as the blood-colored tide burst into the helmet of a prospector friend of Terry's and hers. It was a sight that she had seen many times later in nightmares. Now, as she imagined it, she heard Rick suck in his breath sharply and say hoarsely, "No! No!" "Shall we be moving on?" she asked at last. The suit, filled only with fleshless skeleton, lay deflated on the ground. Rick's face was a dull, sandy, yellowish hue. He nodded and turned off into the desert without a word. That third day was shooting pains, a chest that protested with every step, legs that could not be felt but somehow magically functioned. Many times Lita was ready to quit. She began to stagger and weave erratically across the sand. The only thing that kept her going was the obsession of revenge that seemed to provide a limitless source of power whenever she seemed weakest. And Rick was getting bad. He seemed about finished. How he managed to keep moving, Lita could not imagine. He fell repeatedly, but pulled himself doggedly back to his feet and stumbled after her. When she flopped to the sand toward nightfall, he gestured her to her feet, and when she failed to get up, he came over and dragged her roughly erect. "Can't stop. Never give up. Gotta keep moving until we die, or get there. Move!" But the Martian night accomplished what she could not. Landmarks became indistinguishable. They soon would have been lost. Lying down, Lita adjusted her head bubble so that it became opaque, conserving the warmth that leaked off so rapidly from a transparent object. At long intervals, she tried to move away from Rick, who had settled right beside her, but each time his hand grabbed her firmly, forcing her back to the sand. He apparently intended to stay awake all night so she wouldn't sneak off. When the morning of the fourth day arrived, they rose and once more moved stiffly, without a word for one another, across the wastes on the route that Lita had selected. Without quite knowing how it had happened, Lita twice found herself on her knees on the sand. She knew she had been staggering, that her strength had long past left her, yet she was still amazed that her legs would not do the bidding of her mind. Each time she fell, Rick jerked her roughly to her feet and supported her until her legs moved automatically again. His eyes were red-rimmed, his lips a ghastly slash of scabs and sores. About mid-morning he began to mumble incoherently, as though his voice alone could keep him sane. The only recognizable word that slid through his lips was, "Water! Water!" It beat like the tone of a bass Callisto Satan temple drum on Lita's strained mind until she began to vision waterfalls and huge cakes of ice on the desert before her. Reality and imagination became mixed until she wondered if there was a place called Mars and if the past few days were real. And it became noon, then mid-afternoon. Suddenly the waterhole appeared as a dark spot on the featureless landscape before them, distinguishable only by the lichens that surrounded it. They both broke into a shuffling, jerky trot. Lita was yards behind Rick when he reached the mud hole. Instead of flinging himself down to the moisture, he stiffened. Then his voice broke into a babbling cackle.
He pointed to the permametal sign staked in the watery mud, a death's head symbol embossed on its surface, the interplanetary symbols for death etched into the age-resisting metal. Then his hand moved like doom to the skeleton that lay, head touching the red mud, on the edge of the hole. Ignoring Lita completely, his voice broke into a hideous sing-song of wild laughter, and the word "poison" tumbled endlessly from his throat. He stopped abruptly and turned to the desert. The lines of agony on his face smoothed out, and the old sardonic grin twisted its way to his cheeks. Only his eyes gleamed madly. With a tremendous effort, he said loudly, "Water! There! Only a little way off!" And he staggered off into the desert, his arms extended eagerly, his hands fluttering aimlessly. Lita watched him go, watched him chase his mirage out into the Martian wastes that extended for hundreds of miles without the slightest trace of water, watched him stagger into oblivion until he became small with the distance. Kneeling, she pushed the mud aside in the waterhole, forming a small trough into which the red water could seep. Then she advanced the gauge on her head bubble until she was breathing almost pure oxygen. Patiently, she breathed in the mixture. After 15 minutes, she removed the head bubble and bent her lips to the accumulated water. Her oxygen-saturated system would easily permit her to go a full 10 or more minutes without having to take a breath. Twice, she lay back and let the water regain its level, then drank. Satisfied at last, she placed the head bubble once more into its flange in the suit. Rising, she pulled the poison sign from the mud and carried it over to the skeleton. There she eased herself to the sand and gently placed her hand on the head of the skeleton. "We did it, Terry," she said gently. There was triumph in her voice, a feeling of peace and wholeness once more inside her. "The fools thought they could beat us. 4 days to make an easy 5-hour walk, circling around and around, waiting and planning and killing. Now they are dead, and I can give you a decent burial. Forgive me, darling, for moving you over here that first night, but I needed the sign and you to get even. Thanks for your help."